Hi, everyone. Good morning. Thank you all for being here. My name is Scott Jon Siegel. I was lead designer on HoloVista, and I want to tell you the story of how it was designed and developed. This is a story about an unconventional design process and what it took for us to find a unique structure for expressing a beautiful narrative through gameplay. It's also 76 slides in 30 minutes, so please buckle up, silence your cell phones, and let's get started. I've been designing games professionally for the last 14 years, almost exclusively in the casual free-to-play space. And after years of full-time employment and a brief attempt to depart the industry entirely, I started freelancing and consulting in 2016. And then in 2017, I was introduced to Star and Nadia of Aconite. Nadia Lev is a professional photographer, writer, and artist. Star St. Germain is an illustrator, musician, poet, and graphic designer. And together they founded the company Aconite in order to expand their combined creative skills into a more interactive medium. I still remember our first meeting in it was a sunny December in a fancy San Francisco coffee shop. I ordered a chai, they got matching matcha lattes, and we sat and discussed their company and their aspirations. Star and Nadia wanted my help designing a game. I asked what kind, and they said they didn't know. What they did know was what they wanted the game to achieve. Aconite was founded on the idea of crafting immersive experiences that would blur the lines between fiction and reality, and they wanted their first game to tell a compelling story about technology and culture. To them, the game's genre didn't matter, at least not yet. That game would eventually become HoloVista, but what HoloVista was changed throughout our creative process, and finding the shape of HoloVista required us to be flexible on what kind of game it was in order to achieve Aconite's goals. And this genre-fluid approach, this mechanical agnosticism, is what allowed us to find the structure we ultimately landed on. And I want to walk through the steps we took to get there and the most important things that we learned. That game design is more than just mechanics. And for story-focused games, a thematics-first approach lets you consider mechanics that will help tell the type of story you want to tell, rather than trying to cram your type of story into a predefined structure. But thematics-first doesn't mean story-first. And sometimes finding the best narrative structure means not tying it to any one particular plot, and instead crafting a structure that can tell the type of story you want to tell, and only then crafting a narrative that works best within that structure. And that narrative can be best served through gameplay when contrivance is embraced. That allowing for game-like structure doesn't come at the cost of immersion and can actually provide better scaffolding for expression than an adherence to realism. And lastly, that the best possible game you can make is one you can actually ship. We compromised heavily on the ambition of HoloVista, but those compromises led us to the thing we made, which is exactly what it needed to be. And if there's a fifth learning to be had from this talk, it is this: document your process. Our ability to reflect back on HoloVista's development owes to us embracing documentation from a very early stage. It's how we were able to learn from every choice, good and bad. It's how I was able to write this talk. Before diving in, I do want to take a moment to acknowledge that what HoloVista is, everything that it accomplishes, owes to a great deal more than just its mechanical design. And though this talk doesn't cover these other aspects, it would feel unusual and wrong to not give credit for the game's holistic shape to its other critical components. The incredible story crafted by our narrative designers, Strix Beltran and Corey O'Brien, with additional writing by Sarah Carr. The surreal vaporwave aesthetic brought to life by our environmental artists, Blake Catherine and Andrew Morgan. Our haunting soundtrack by electronic artist Mariode, atmospheric sound design by John Leidecker, and our accessibility efforts spearheaded and evangelized by producer Meredith Hall. To say nothing of our code crafted by Jay Treat and Dexter Lonis, tireless QA by Cindy Ijima, and additional literally everything by associate producer Andy Hegedus. And of course, the work of Star and Nadia, who not only co-directed the game, but also contributed art, animation, code, design, and music alongside the team. This was a small but formidable group of incredibly talented people, and the game wouldn't exist as it does today without every single one of them. Okay, so what is HoloVista? HoloVista is a little hard to describe sometimes. Maybe it's simplest to call it an immersive hidden object and storytelling game. You could also call it a social media simulation or a visual novel. It's also a VR game, but without VR goggles, an augmented reality game without the reality. HoloVista is styled as a fictional Instagram-like social media app. You play as Carmen Razzo, an aspiring architect living in New York in the nearish future, and you experience the story entirely through the literal lens of her social media. When you open the camera in Carmen's app, you are viewing a virtual 3D environment, a place that Carmen has been. And you can move your device to look around as though you were looking through your phone's own camera. And of course, you take photographs, which you post to Carmen's feed to progress the story. And through these mechanisms, HoloVista expresses a beautiful, haunting narrative about memory, identity, and authenticity. No spoilers in this talk, but if you want to play it yourself, and you should, it only takes around 3 hours to complete. That was the game that we shipped in 2020, but in 2017, none of that was known. All that we knew was the highest of high level. So Star, Nadia, and I would meet regularly at an artist co-op space in downtown San Francisco, and our earliest discussions focused around Star and Nadia's interests, both in modes of storytelling and topics prevalent in technology and culture news of the moment. And this is what I mean by thematics first. They shared short stories that evoked the worlds they wanted to play in. We discussed common topics of interest ranging from AI and computer vision to divination and magic, Mechanical Turks and Yahoo Answers. But the one thing we weren't discussing at this stage were specific game concepts. We weren't in a rush to lock down a genre or core mechanics, not before we knew what our thematic focus was going to be. And this has since become kind of a core thesis of mine, the idea that holistically game design is a function of all aspects of a game's development. We may think of design as being just about the game's mechanics, but game development is a multifaceted discipline with each facet informing and being informed by every other. Whether they are the game's thematics, its themes, setting, narrative goals, and story, its aesthetics, the art style, look and feel, music, sound design, its technology, the code, engine, infrastructure, and even its business, the underlying business model, as well as its production schedule, resourcing, and the expectations of investors or other stakeholders. There are always interlocking dependencies, and for any type of design problem at any stage of development, it can be useful to consider the design through all these facets, not just mechanics. For us, our focus was on thematics, first and foremost, which led us to start establishing core pillars of our thematics, what we wanted to come across through whatever narrative we expressed and whatever mechanics we used to express it. We wanted the player to have agency, both in self-expression and in their impact on the game's systems. We wanted the experience to be immersive, to blur fiction and reality, and we wanted there to be a community aspect, emphasizing empathy and connection to others. And at this stage, we were seeking both thematic and aesthetic inspiration, looking at interesting storytelling structures, particular themes of interest, as well as art styles, imagery, vibes that we wanted to evoke. One topic in particular was Cambridge Analytica, the political consulting firm that would become embroiled in controversy in 2018. And as we discussed its implications more and more, the micro-targeting, predictive algorithms, big data fueled by personal information, we realized that we had a lot to say. So we decided to make social media our focus. And if we wanted to blur fiction to comment on reality, then we would speak to social media through its own lens. And this is when the mechanical conversation started in earnest. Social media was a thematic wrapper. What kind of game would live within it? Well, fortunately, social media is already heavily systematized and suggestive of a lot of mechanics. So we saw at our disposal a wide range of levers. Followers as indicators of both success and audience, the social graph as a mechanism for the visibility of content, whether public or private, the dopamine hits of likes and reactions, comments as a mode of discourse around posted content, and actions that could have both local and global impact. Lots to work with. Where do we start? Our early concepts were heavily systematized. One used a reigns-style mechanic where liking, commenting, and reblogging would cause social status changes that could lead to fail states. Another had a friendly AI who would help you go viral by suggesting the types of images and captions that could attract different audiences. These explorations were interesting, but not quite compelling enough. Around this time, Nadia was using Proto.io to build our various prototypes and discovered that they had added an interactive walkthrough feature where you could use your phone's gyroscope to view a 3D space. And similar tech was being used for real estate listings, but Nadia, being a photographer, took the feature and added a shutter button. And suddenly you're not just looking around a space, suddenly you're looking through a camera. And the possibilities for this were immediately apparent. It tied to our themes of social media. The VR feeling was immersive and reality blurring. Players had agency through self-expression, and there were plenty of mechanical implications. We evolved the prototype with the ability to detect what you took photos of, kind of a Zillow meets Pokemon Snap. And with that, we had a new mechanic that tied to our thematics and could give the player agency in our story. Great. So what are we going to do with it? Well, we could really do anything. The player could visit different locations and take photos, and we could evaluate the photos based on their content, and we could have the story change depending on what they took photos of. So we envisioned this as a loop of taking photos, picking captions, reading the feed, chatting with characters, and then traveling to new locations to take photos, and so on. Our first GDD described a system where player choices could influence the game's world and story direction. Depending on what the things the player photographed and the things they said in chat, the narrative would unfold in one way or another. And because this wasn't already complex enough, we then expanded the concept further to have more types of player choice influence parts of the system. And it's easy now to look back and realize that this was ambitious, especially for a new team, and especially given that as lead designer, I'd never actually worked on a branching narrative game before. So it was for the best that we decided to build out a full vertical of this prototype to demo and playtest at the Internet Art Festival XOXO in September of 2018. It imposed a deadline on our work, which was incredibly useful given the scope of the concept. This version, called Filter, framed the player character as an up-and-coming influencer, getting paid to travel to new locations and take photos of places and events. The player would open the camera into a location. They'd be able to look around and take a photo, which they would apply a filter to, and then pick one of two captions which were related to what was in the photo. The photo would then get posted to the feed, which would also populate with posts from other characters from around the same time period. The player can read those posts to get a sense of the world and the larger story. At the same time, characters would reach out over chat, and the player had choices as to how to respond, and depending on the choices, the characters might suggest the player visit one location or another. So the player would use the location feature built into the app to visit those new locations where they would take another photo, apply another filter, add a caption, and post it, resulting in more feed and another character messaging them, etc., etc. That's the loop. This was the narrative map for just our prototype build, with 5 locations to visit, and all this variance and choice structure amounting to about 15 minutes of gameplay. So how'd it go? Well, players loved the look and feel, with massive credit to Star's graphic design, and the moment of opening the camera into a virtual space was a repeated highlight. But they didn't know what they should be photographing. They didn't understand the significance of their actions, and most players weren't bothering to read the content in the social media feed. So they either didn't follow the story, or if they didn't care enough to get invested, in part because the idea of playing as a social media influencer was also unappealing. And more testing after XOXO reinforced the feedback we received. What we had wasn't resonating. How could we make it work? Well, players were having a hard time following the story and knowing what to do next, so we added a journaling quest system to help guide them. And the "you're an influencer" story itself wasn't engaging, so we started experimenting with different narrative ideas. Our only constant in this exploration was the structure we'd already built. How could we create something more compelling around the idea of photo taking and posting? So every team member went off on pitching their own version of the game. Maybe you were posting photos you took in your dreams, or you were an amnesiac revisiting places you had been, taking photos to recover your memory, or you were a detective using social media to solve a murder case. We kept trying to make the structure work by tweaking the narrative. We wanted to know what the story of the game was, and if we could crack the story, we could figure out the right mechanics for it. So why were you taking photos? What were the places you were visiting? Why is there a feed? What is it that I'm trying to do? How do I win? How do I lose? Can I lose? And most critically, why would the player want to do any of this? What was their emotional investment? We struggled to find answers to these questions that we found satisfying, and we struggled to find a shape of the game that worked, and we were running out of ideas, and we were running out of time. My first meeting with Star and Nadia had been at the end of 2017, and by the end of 2018, we still had no real certainty about what the game was going to be. After 12 whole months on a direction that wasn't working, the project was in a bit of an existential spiral. After exploring so many ideas, trying so many things, there was a real fear that we might never figure it out and the game might not ever ship. So we entered 2019 in kind of a dark place, and we did what any reasonable humans would do in the face of overwhelming despair. We watched YouTube. Star had been playing Return of the Obra Dinn and wanted us all to watch the episode of Mark Brown's Game Maker's Toolkit on how the game works. If you haven't played it, Obra Dinn is an adventure game set in the 1800s where you have to uncover the fate of 60 people on board a merchant ship that had mysteriously vanished 5 years prior. You do so by using a mystical pocket watch to rewind time to the moment of each character's death, and you use their dialogue, the environment, and deductive reasoning skills to identify each person in the ship's manifest and how they died or disappeared. It's an incredible game, and I credit it and Game Maker's Toolkit with saving our project, so thank you, Lucas Pope, and thank you, Mark Brown. In the video, Mark Brown was interested in how Obra Dinn succeeded as a detective game, despite not having traditional detective-y mechanics. And he called particular attention to the mechanics of the pocket watch, whose behavior is never fully explained, and the player's journal that only confirms correct answers in sets of 3. And he likened these to similar mechanical conceits and limitations in Sam Barlow's Her Story. And he refers to these mechanics as contrived, but he doesn't mean it in a bad way. As he puts it, the worlds of Obra Dinn and Her Story are not trying to be realistic. Instead, they have stories, gameplay systems, and means of interactivity that exist purely for the purposes of allowing for deductive reasoning without taking power from the player's hands. And this, for me, was a galaxy brain moment, because the greatest impediment we were perpetually up against was narrative justification for mechanics. Why would the player be doing this? How do you explain this in the world of the story? Does this interaction make sense in the context of a social media app? This had led us to prioritizing verisimilitude, or the appearance of being true or real. Because for us, we believed that immersion depended on the mechanics of the game being believable in the context of the game's world. The game is styled as the app itself, and if the app feels too much like a game or behaves in game-like ways, we believed it would break immersion. And this also meant that all of our UI had to be diegetic, or embedded in the fiction, rather than breaking the fourth wall. So everything the player does had to make sense as things you do in a social media app. But this devotion to supposed realism was boxing us into a corner. There were more things that we couldn't do than things we could. So what would change if we allowed ourselves contrivance? What if we let the game be a game and trusted the player to excuse contrivances for the sake of making the story and gameplay work? What if we let ourselves get really contrived? So here's what we knew. Players liked the act of opening the camera and looking around, but they didn't know what they should photograph. And they liked the thematic wrapper of social media, but they didn't understand how their choices matter. And they weren't following the story because they weren't reading the feed. But there was one other thing we knew, one moment in the demo that folks responded well to, and that was the sacred circle. At one point in the XOXO build, the character Valerie invites the player to her apartment to attend a sacred ritual, but tells them to not photograph the ritual itself. And this moment came up in a number of playtests because it's the only time a character explicitly calls out a specific element of a scene. So obviously everyone going into the scene immediately looks for the ritual. Some people photographed it, others didn't. But at least for that one moment, everyone understood the ramifications of their choice. And we credited this as the one time we were making the choice space explicit, the one moment our branching narrative through photography worked. But maybe that wasn't the real takeaway. Maybe the takeaway was that the game was more interesting when players knew what to look for and what they should be photographing. So maybe we should just tell them what to find in each scene. We could even give them a list of things to find. What kind of game does that start to sound like? So one of the most successful games I ever worked on was a game called Gardens of Time. And Gardens of Time is a hidden object game. And you know the genre, cluttered 2D scenes, lists of things to find and click, little bits of story interspersed between linear progression. It's simple, but very effective, and more importantly, fun. But I wanted my work with Aconite to be different than everything else I'd done. I didn't want to say, oh, this immersive narrative experience, this artful vehicle for storytelling, let's just make it a hidden object game, like that other thing I did that one time. But here I was, being resistant to contrivance. Because this was a structure that actually worked really well for us. Giving players a list of objects to photograph provides them with clear direction. It forces them to observe the environments more closely and gets them to spend more time in each place. And we could also use the spaces themselves more creatively. We could employ environmental storytelling and use the object list as a way to guarantee that the player would notice certain things. But this was also us arguing for the most seismic shift in the game's direction yet. We weren't just changing the story, we were changing the genre while still trying to preserve the overall structure. We needed to prove that it was going to work. So we created a new prototype to see if hidden object gameplay was actually effective. And we called it FTN, or fuck the narrative. Because at this stage, I didn't want to discuss story at all. This was just about finding a fun core mechanic. We couldn't worry about why the player would be taking photos or why there's a list. So fun first, fiction later. No plot, just play. FTN was easy to build using the same scenes as the XOXO demo, with a little extra non-diegetic UI for listing objects and crossing them off as you photographed them. It was obvious how to play and fun to look around the scenes and take photos. And players were even picking up on more details that they hadn't noticed in earlier playtests. FTN was a success. But the problems extended beyond just making it a hidden object game. We needed players to actually read the social media feed, and we needed them to understand how to progress, and we needed them to understand the story through this structure. So we created a 3-step prototype plan to prove this new direction could work. FTN just needed to answer one question: is hidden object gameplay fun with our scenes? Step 2 was about getting players to read the feed, and step 3 was about closing the loop and testing whether all this contrivance actually did a better job telling a story. So what's wrong with the feed? Well, it was easy for players to miss it entirely. The moment they landed on the feed, the chat icon was badged, pulling their attention away, and the feed had no mechanical purpose. There was nothing to do on it. We wanted players to just read it out of sheer interest without us adding an incentive to do so. And since they could skip right to chat, it didn't actually need to be read at all in order to progress. So let's get contrived again. For our second prototype, we turned the feed into a reading comprehension puzzle. The posts that the player character would the posts from the player character were already in the feed with captions and comments, but the images themselves would be missing. So the player must open their photo drawer, and from the photos they just took in hidden object gameplay, select the one that matches the caption and comments. It's no Her Story or Obra Dinn, but it forced players to prove they'd read the feed to progress. And it made it more fun to engage, as well as connecting to the photos they'd actually taken. And now it was time to bring it all together. We already knew that hidden object gameplay would unlock new feed content, but now the feed could gate chat, requiring players to complete the feed puzzles in each section to unlock new messages. And only then, after reading those messages, does the next hidden object scene unlock. And each of the three parts of the structure, hidden object, feed, chat, would move in a loop, always in the same direction. And we could use diegetic badges on the UI as breadcrumbs to make sure it was always clear what the player had to do next. But this direction meant entirely abandoning branching narrative, which was the right call. This pivot was about finding the right structure, but it was also about scope. The complexity of what we had spec'd was never realistic, but it was in our best interest to remove the complexities of our branching narrative system entirely to simplify our development. We brought our final prototype to GDC 2019 to test with some trusted, highly critical peers. In this version, we reintroduce an actual story, a short two-scene plot where the player character attends an open mic night and meets a small coven of millennial witches, #Hex the Patriarchy. Proving the structure meant not only proving that it functioned as a game, but that it also functioned as a storytelling mechanism. And it worked. It was fun, the loop made sense, and our testers were able to follow the story. We'd finally cracked the game structure, and we were back on track with a path to production. And what's more, we knew exactly how a story could be told within our structure, through the places visited by the player, the photos that they would take, the posts they would make in the feed, along with the comments on those posts, posts from other characters, and lastly, the private conversations had over chat. This is also what let us find our narrative designers. We attended GDC 2019 with a robust narrative design document, laying out our exact structure of where and how narrative could be delivered. And we were also able to generate a wealth of other pre-production documentation, outlining the remaining open questions, anticipating every possible roadblock that could arise during our production. We felt confident that every contingency was covered, but of course, you know what they say about hindsight. Yes. Some of our challenges in 2020 were absolutely pandemic-related, and others are just part of game development. Our working capacities were severely diminished. Some of us had to take time off, and we ran into technical issues that ate into our engineering estimates. But we also received invaluable feedback from sensitivity readers that resulted in some story rewrites, which also required other necessary and worthwhile content changes. And playtesting feedback also led to a few late-stage design tweaks and cutting of a few additional features. It took more time than we wanted, it always does, but the game we now knew as HoloVista slowly started to take shape. You would open the camera into each scene, seeing through Carmen's eyes, finding and photograph the objects listed on screen. And completing each scene would take you to Carmen's social media feed, where you'd match Carmen's captions with the photos just taken to complete her posts, revealing comments, as well as posts from other characters in the story, establishing a world and building a cast. And as you finished each section of feed, those characters would reach out in private messages, direct dialogue that would reveal more about Carmen's relationships and her interior world. And then the next scene would unlock, and you'd find yourself traveling once again to a new location, finding and photographing in each new place as you experience 5 very strange days in the life of Carmen Razzo. On September 30th of 2020, we released HoloVista on iOS, roughly 32 months after Matcha Lattes with Star and Nadia, after our first spirited discussions about making some sort of game, who knew what kind, that would blur the lines between fiction and reality. HoloVista was finally out and available to the world. And I continue to be blown away by how well HoloVista has been received. I've been moved to tears on multiple occasions by some of the honors bestowed on this game. And looking back at our earliest thematic pillars, you can see that even with some divergences, our aspirations were reached in the spirit of the law, if not the letter. Certainly, HoloVista is immersive, and maybe if we sacrificed agency in the sense of embracing a linear narrative over player choice, but our camera feature still allows for a degree of player expression, just as Carmen explores her own agency over the events unfolding. And though we didn't impart a sense of community through multiplayer as originally intended, HoloVista is still a story about social interaction, isolation, and vulnerability, and the importance of finding connection to others and yourself. We achieved these goals because we allowed ourselves to remain genre fluid, mechanically agnostic, for the sake of what we wanted the game to say. And I would argue that this mechanical agnosticism extended beyond just a focus on thematics. It was technology that brought us the AR camera that became the game's centerpiece, without which we never would have found our eventual genre. Our aesthetics provided our unique look and feel, and the talents of Blake, Andrew, and Starr in creating beautiful scenes and locales led us to gameplay and narrative that focused around environments and architecture, and influenced the story's slow dive into surrealism and the uncanny. And even business, our pivot to hidden object was a production-driven decision. We needed a way to work with what we had to come up with a solution that didn't require starting over. And that this design shares a structure with earlier versions is entirely due to the constraints of needing to still ship in a reasonable time frame, even after a significant shift in direction. So what did we learn? HoloVista would have never found its shape if we allowed mechanics alone to dictate the shape of the game. Pivoting genres entirely required us thinking of mechanics as only one facet of game design to be considered. And that pivot was necessary because our design wasn't helping us tell a story. We got stuck in late 2018 trying to find the right kind of story that would make our gameplay work. But the reality was that our gameplay didn't work, and no narrative was going to fix that. Finding the right solution required us putting aside story entirely, as with FTN, and focusing on finding core mechanics and a loop that were engaging, and building a solid narrative structure out from there. Only then did we explore writing new story to fit that structure. And part of our challenge came from striving for realism in our game's mechanics. Immersion can easily become an excuse for things being obtuse or non-intuitive. It's okay for games to be games. HoloVista still looks like a social media app, even if it has a level select screen. The scenes are still beautiful and draw you in, even if they list the things you need to find and photograph. Our immersion is aided by the contrivances that make it intuitive and functional. Nothing is less immersive than not knowing how a system works or what you're supposed to do. And ultimately, our design pivoted as it did because we needed a path to actually putting it out into the world. Good design is working within constraints, and for professional game development, there's no more critical constraint than the realities of production. We could have gone down a hole in 2019 trying to make our branching narrative structure work. We could have thrown the entire thing out and started with an entirely different concept, but the thing that got us to ship was finding out how to work with what we had, pivoted and scoped to create a visible end to development. And that's why HoloVista exists as it does today. It is exactly the shape that it needed to be. I frequently described my role on HoloVista as creating a narrative scaffolding. My job was always in support of Aconite's vision. It was in support of Starr and Nadia's aspirations, Strix and Corey's story, Blake and Andrew's art, Mario's music. The proudest I've ever felt as a designer is knowing that I helped create a structure that allowed something beautiful to be expressed. And I hope this talk helps all of you create beautiful things and enables you to support more beautiful expression in our industry. Thank you all so much for your time. I'm told we have 3 minutes because I went slightly faster than I had rehearsed. So if anyone has any questions, they can ask them here, or we'll go across the hall when our time is up. Are there mics, or am I just repeating the questions? There is a mic.
Hi, that was really great. It's a really amazing adventure that you've taken. Have you thought about think back and think about the times that you've gotten the support that you have? I've seen a lot of people who have made indie games and they've had an ambition, and a lot of them have never even thought, like, would I even play this game myself? Or is this a game? And so some people have been able to make their game with the support and love of their friends who are like that encourage their vision. But would you have gone back in time and changed the way that you had gotten feedback? Would you have also gone to other places to have people who maybe not supporting you personally, but are supporting you by giving you feedback on, would I play this game? Is this, would you change the way that you gotten feedback in the past?
I think we always would have welcomed more feedback. I feel very grateful that we got the feedback we did when we did. And that feedback continued to come in throughout development. And as frustrating as it is to be mid-development and for people to be giving you feedback that it doesn't work, that's exactly the feedback we needed to hear to know how to change it, right? I was very happy to be soliciting feedback from people who were not afraid to be honest with us about how they felt about the game, because people could have been polite and kind and said the XOXO version was fun and delightful, and maybe we wouldn't have gone through the process we did in terms of asking ourselves, maybe this isn't the right direction.
Yeah, you kind of need both. Yeah, cool. Thank you.
Polite and unkind, yes. There's kindness and unkindness sometimes. I think that's our time, but we'll be going across the way, and I can chat more and answer more questions there. Thank you all so much. Have a good day.